uh, as well as or a research biologist for the Curlew crew. I've been with the Intermountain Bird Observatory now. This will be my 8th season. And I'm super excited to be hosting these workshops and having the Golden Eagle Audubon Society group come on up to New Meadows. It's a beautiful time of year. Unpredictable weather, but that's mountain spring. So anyway, before we get started here, I typically like to start by showing the skull of a long-billed curlew. So some people might not have seen one before, and this is just kind of an interesting thing to look at, just to kind of give you the gravity of how long their bill actually is. And so right here, obviously you can see the skull, and then the rest is this massive bill. And so the big takeaway here is that even though this bill looks kind of ominous, like it could do some damage if they came down and hit you with it, the fact of the matter is they don't use this bill for any form of defense. So if they were to come down and try to attack a coyote or maybe a badger, and if they were to hit that animal, what's going to happen is there's a really good chance that they're going to break that lower mandible right off. So they won't be able to eat without that, obviously. So their bill is adapted strictly for eating. And these guys also don't have talons like raptors. So then it makes one wonder, well, what do they have? You know, what strategy do they use to ward off predators or defend their family? And we're going to get into that here in a few minutes when I get this going. So let me start sharing my screen. And we will start the program. Well, let me go back. Okay, great. So as you can see on the screen there, the long-billed curlew here in Idaho is a species of greatest conservation need. And basically what that means is they're not endangered, but this is putting them on the radar because our localized population throughout Southwest Idaho is in a roughly between 95 to 99% decline right now. And so this is a title basically that's given to species that we need to take a closer look at what's happening with their population declines. So here's a long-billed curlew. So this is basically just their contact call. And I'm hoping everybody can hear that okay. Can somebody pop in the chat that my sound is coming through okay? Excellent, thank you. I just wanted to make sure. So it's really interesting to see this bird with a really long neck, long bill, those long wader legs, walking around in the high desert on our public lands. And it's really cool to think that we have North America's largest shorebird right here in our backyard. And it's a migratory species, but they like to migrate to the areas throughout the Intermountain West that have short grassland habitats. And so their bill can grow up to about 8.5 inches long. And if anybody's ever held a chicken or a duck before, that's kind of what it's like to hold a long-billed curlew. So they're only about 1 pound or 2. And sometimes they get confused with things like the Wilson snipe. And I tell people to think about, you can hold a snipe in the palm of one hand, but if you were to hold a curlew, you would need 2 hands. And this species exhibits something called sexual dimorphism. And it's just a big fancy science word that means that there's a difference between the males and the females. So I'll give you guys a couple of seconds and feel free if you want to unmute yourselves. I'm going to quiz you. There's a male and a female in the picture here. Does anybody want to take a stab at which one is which? And you can throw it in the chat too if it's easier. So it's really important certain times of day that we're out in the field to figure out who we're looking for, because in the mornings we're going to look for females, and in the mornings we're going to look for males, and I'll explain that here in a few minutes. But looking at this picture, the females are the larger of the species, so they're a little bit bigger bodied with a much longer bill that seems to come more straight off the face. And the males are a little bit smaller, and they have a shorter bill that tends to kind of curve off the face a little quicker than the female's bill does. So why are we studying the long-billed curlews? Well, as a lot of you probably know, many generations have grown up utilizing the public lands all throughout Southwest Idaho. And so apparently back in the day, curlews used to come in these huge flocks that look like clouds to the public lands. And year after year, there were people that started to notice that they just weren't coming in those numbers anymore. So some phone calls were starting to be made to the Bureau of Land Management and also to the Fish and Game, saying, does anybody there know what's happening? And during that time, there was a researcher with the University of Montana, and he's the gentleman in the center of the picture with the cowboy hat on, and his name is Roland Redmond. Well, he was interested in coming down and studying this issue for his thesis. And so what he was able to do was lay down a really good population foundation for the area that is known as the area of critical environmental concern, which is in the Middleton area. And those public lands are surrounded by like Emmett and Parma and Notice and in that, and Marsing in the really outstretched reaches there. And so his study took place around 1979, and he was able to document roughly 2,000 individual curlews. But over time, the decline kept happening. And then we got involved as the Intermountain Bird Observatory, and we replicated his survey routes. So we ran the same roads throughout the breeding season, doing the same point count surveys. And we were coming up with estimates around 100 individual curlews. So that's a pretty alarming decline when you think about that's only 40 short years. And what's even more alarming is that historically, this exact same area was known as having the densest curlew nesting grounds in all of North America. And so that's really hard to get our heads wrapped around today when this area is now in a 99% decline. And it's kind of ironic because it's actually called the long-billed curlew habitat area of critical environmental concern. So the million-dollar question is, why are these birds declining? And what's important to remember, as a migratory species, they're not spending their entire life in one location, right? So they're spending time on their breeding grounds, and they're also spending time on their overwintering grounds. So we're not going to want to just focus on what could be impacting the population in one place or the other. We're going to want to get a view of that entire annual life cycle. And we knew right off the bat that predators were going to be a huge issue because curlews are ground nesters. And so if you haven't spent any time on the public lands and you love wildlife, I would highly recommend taking some time and heading out that way. This is just a small sampling of what I would see just within 10 minutes of pulling out of the public lands. And there's even more out there. But as far as curlews go, this is a small sampling of what can cause a lot of trouble, especially ravens. Ravens are very smart, as we all know. And in fact, we're not allowed to approach a curlew nest if there's a raven or a crow, say on a cattle trough or on a telephone pole or on a rancher's gate, because they watch what you're doing. And if we approach that nest to take our GPS point and leave, there's a pretty good chance that that raven or crow is going to go see what we were checking out. But again, we want to be thinking about the threats that could be happening to this population all across their range. And so 80% of our breeding study flock that we have transmitted heads to the Central Valley and the Imperial Valleys of California. And if you're not familiar with those areas, it's that central area that's full of agriculture. It's also known as the breadbasket of California. And so 80% of our birds go there, and the other 20 head towards Mexico. And there's a lot of agriculture in both areas. And let's just take California, for example. a lot of times we hear they're going through a lot of drought, if not a perpetual state of drought. And so that could be affecting the crops, which could be affecting the resources um, of which the curlew rely on. So curlews eat copious amounts of insects. They're a great natural insect control. And so if the crops aren't doing great, maybe the insects aren't doing so great. And also farmers use herbicides and pesticides on the crops. So curlews may be running into trouble if they're eating lots of pesticide-laden insects. And another issue with agriculture is there's a lot of turnover. And so they'll rotate crops, right? So they could be rotating their crops to something like either almonds, pistachios, or walnuts. And those take a lot of water. So what farmers have been doing is they've been trying to conserve water, and they'll actually run irrigation under the ground, which is great for saving water, but it's not so great for the wildlife that relies on that standing water on the ground. So that could be causing an issue too. And if we bring it back up here to the Intermountain West, and we'll just choose Idaho since that's where we're at, the public lands are a great place to recreate. You can ride your ATVs, you can ride your horses, you can also target shoot. You can take steel targets out, or you can also, there's a species of ground squirrel that you can shoot with a permit. And so there's all sorts of recreation that happens out there. And when we look at all this, and then we bring in the factor that Boise's population is just busting at the seams, right? So everybody wants to move to Boise, and the public lands are a huge draw. So now we have this huge influx of new population that is now putting new pressures on the public lands. And that's affecting curlews and all sorts of other wildlife out there. So when we look at this huge picture of where the birds are spending their entire annual life cycle, it's really hard in the beginning to know which one of these or combination of these is causing an impact that could lead to the decline that the curlews are currently in. So let's just take a moment and we'll talk about their nesting biology. So curlews typically lay 3 to 4 eggs. And as you can see, they don't spend much time making any kind of a nest. A lot of times they'll utilize a cow's hoof print or a depression that's already in the ground. And they'll maybe add a little grass to it while they're sitting there. And we've also found some of the nest cups that have a lot of ground squirrel poop in it. And so they will add some nesting materials in there. But the female has an interesting strategy in her egg laying. So she'll actually lay 1 egg, and then she takes off for a day and a half while the next egg develops. And that doesn't sound like a very good strategy in a sense, if it's so dangerous and the landscape is crawling with predators and there's cattle walking around. But if you think about it, she's really relying on an adaptation that those eggs have. And that adaptation is camouflage. So in the desert, those eggs blend in really, really well. They're just this mottled kind of greenish brown egg. And they also lay their eggs next to inanimate objects like cow patties. That's why you see those cow patties in this picture. And it's interesting when I look at all the different pictures that I've taken, I'd say 98% of the pictures all have cow patties in them. And so we think that's another form of camouflage coming from the aerial perspective. So let's just pretend there's a hungry raven zipping really low to the ground, that perhaps if there's enough to visually distract them, they won't see those eggs laying there right there in plain sight. And what's interesting is they actually have to incubate those eggs for a full month. And if you think about it, that's a really long time to have to protect those eggs. So camouflage is paramount. And it's not just going to be eggs, right? It's going to be the chicks, and it's also going to be the adults. And so the chicks here, as you can see, they're hatched out fully feathered. And these chicks here probably, I would guess, maybe an hour or 2 old. So their eyes are open, they're dried off, and they're going to be up and running with the parents right away. Because if they just sat there and waited to be fed, they're going to be a little appetizer for, you know, a hungry coyote, right? So they need to be up and mobile to be able to hide in the grass. And so down here, we see a female who's sitting really tight to the nest. And hopefully you guys can tell, but there's a big old dried out cow patty right behind her. So she's using that as excellent concealment. And I know this is a female, not because I can see her relative body size or I can tell how long her bill is, but it's because this picture was taken during the day. And so remember in the beginning when I said, I need to know if I'm looking for a male or a female, depending on the time of day. So in the mornings, we need to be out there just about sunrise in place, and we're going to wait for females to fly in because they've been gone all night while the male incubates. So she's going to come in as soon as the sun's rising and relieve the male from his duty. So she's going to come in, sometimes she'll give a little peep, and then he'll take off, and then she settles on the nest and sits really tight for the rest of the day. And then we head back out into the field. And in the evenings, when the sun starts to sink below the horizon, we're going to watch for the switch. So the males are going to come in, and then they're going to relieve the females. And so that's how they're able to keep those eggs incubated nonstop while still being able to take off, get something to eat, and be able to get some restful sleep. And another thing I want to point out is during this incubation time, the curlews are extremely quiet. They don't want to jump off that nest every single time they get threatened by a predator. Because if they were to do that every time, you can probably imagine what's going to happen. They're going to start to attract a lot of unwanted attention from either coyotes or ravens or badgers. And so unless their life feels absolutely threatened by that predator, they will not flush off that nest. And these guys do the same predator strategy that the killdeers do, because these guys are in the same family. The killdeers I call the baby cousin or the little cousin of the curlew. So you guys probably have maybe had experiences with killdeer where they'll pop off the nest and act like they have a broken wing. Well, curlews do the same thing. They just don't seem to do it, at least from what I've witnessed, they don't seem to do it as quickly as the killdeer do. But that all kind of changes as soon as the chicks are about to hatch. And so this is probably maybe 5-minute old curlew. And so you can see the feathers are still very wet. The eyes are still sealed shut. And I would say probably the week of hatching, there's like a little switch that goes off in the parent's brain and they become extremely aggressive. So this is when they're going to pop off the nest if anything even looks in their direction, and they're going to chase it off. But remember, they're not going to use their bill for any form of defense, and they don't have talons like a raptor. So the strategy that curlews use to ward off predators is this awful blood-curdling scream. And while they're screaming at the predator, they start mobbing, which is basically dive bombing the predator over and over until that predator leaves the area. And it's not always easy for the two parents to do that. So what happens is it becomes kind of like a multi-level strategy where that alarm call goes out across the landscape and all the other nesting curlews in the area can hear it. So now all those other curlews are going to help the initial parents that set off that alarm call chase off the predator. So I'm going to play for you that alarm call really quick, just so you can hear the difference between the initial contact call I played and then this alarm call. And I know it's not going to sound as scary as if you were out in the field, but try to imagine what it would sound like, because this is only going to be one curlew sending off the alarm call. So just try to imagine what it would be like to have maybe 10 or 20 of these 2-pound birds dive bombing you while screaming. So it's super loud, it's super annoying, and it will not stop until the predator or the human walks away from the area. And so you don't have to get very far either. Like if you can get 200, 300 meters away, all those curlews are going to go back to what they were doing. And another key thing is you don't have to run away if you're getting mobbed. And the big reason why is if you were to take off running, you could run the risk of stepping on a baby curlew. And like I said, within an hour or two, they're already out exploring away from that nest cup. And so it's really important that you understand that they can't hurt you. And so you just kind of duck your head down and you check around your feet and you walk out of the area. Because basically all that alarm call is doing is letting you know that you're too close to a nest or chicks that you're never going to see, and they're trying to protect that family. So here's just a really quick video I took checking a nest to give you a sense of what it's like when those parents send off that first alarm call. So as you see, they get really, really close to you, but they won't run the risk of hurting that beak or breaking it, so they won't hit you. And this is the part of the program that we're hoping that you might want to be a part of, and it's our Curlew satellite tracking program. So we put satellite transmitters on some of the birds that we trap. So we don't put them on all of the birds because they're pretty expensive. So they run about $3,500 a piece. And then there's an additional $1,200 in what's called data fees. So basically, that's a charge for us to have it up online, like basically live streaming. So you could check on your favorite curlew or a couple of curlews 24/7 throughout their entire annual life cycle. So these transmitters are solar powered. And as you can see, there's two little solar windows right there, and they charge up a micro battery. And they send a ping, or they communicate with the satellite infrequently throughout the day. Sometimes it's 4 hours, sometimes it's 8. It depends how much charge that battery has. So you could check on a curlew in the morning and then maybe check on it in the evening, and you'll be able to tell that the dots moved. But we'll talk about the map here in a little bit. So typically on a banding day, we gather up a group of biologists and we head out into the field. And you guys might be familiar with mist nets that we use at our banding stations. And that's actually what we use for curlews, believe it or not. But we use them in the non-traditional sense, meaning we actually carry the net out to where the curlew nest is. And so we have some biologists up on a hillside that are looking down at the nest, and then they'll radio with us as we're walking with the net and let us know when we're over the bird. Because as we're walking out there, we can't see that bird at all because it sees us coming. And remember, it sits really tight to the nest. So as we get closer, they'll let us know, start looking. And so we'll kind of like stand on our tiptoes, and usually one of the net runners will see the curlew. And these nets are really long, so we're not that close to the bird. And that kind of works to our advantage, where they don't, typically flush off the nest. And so we'll drop the poles and that net flutters real softly over the bird, and then they'll pop up. So then we want to get to the bird as soon as possible and secure the wings, and we'll take it out of the net. And I'm sure many of you recognize Jake Carlisle here. He's holding this female. As you can tell, it's during the day. And the nest is down here, and there's another cow patty, just to show you that they really do use those inanimate objects. So then we'll take a bunch of data. We'll, measure the bill. We'll also weigh the bird. And believe it or not, measuring the bill is how we tell how big a long-billed curlew is. So obviously it's a little different than when we go and we get a physical and you stand on the scale and they lift up that metal bar as you're standing there. Well, obviously we can't do that with curlews. So what we do is we measure the bill. And what's really cool about the picture here is this female's bill was so long that our micrometer couldn't measure the entire length. So hopefully you guys can tell there's a bit of her bill hanging off the edge there. So if I remember right, she was about 9 inches long. So that was a really big female curlew. And this is a great representation to show you their feet. Obviously nothing like talons on a raptor. They actually look like just like funky little chicken feet. And that's what they're using to scrape in the ground if they're not using a depression that they have already found for a nest. So Stephanie Coates was our master's student who has since graduated with her master's. She was a part of our program for many years, and she started doing some additional data collection that she brought on board. So we were taking a small blood draw from the wing, and then we were also doing what was called a buccal swab. And that all that is taking like a cotton swab. You can just tell they have like a Q-tip right there, and they're gently opening the beak and just rolling it around right inside the bird's bill, just to get some of those cheek cells to study some of the genetics. And what was really interesting about the first time when we did that, we discovered that the bill has its very own adaptation. And I don't know if I'll be able to, let me see if I can show you guys this really quick, and remind me at the end if this doesn't show up very well. So every time we had a curlew in our hands, we had noticed that this section of the bill, I'll hold it up right here, it had all these ridges on it. And I'm going to try to hold this closer. Can you guys tell there's ridges right there, those little lines? And when I run my fingernail over it, I can feel them. And so each time we had a bird in our hands, like I said, we saw these ridges, but we really didn't understand what they were for. And it wasn't until we did this first buccal swab that we figured out what those ridges were for. So this is a fun little video that we took in the field, and it's on YouTube, and I think it's under something like bendy beak curlew. So take a look and see if you can tell what's happening at the tip of the bird's beak as Stephanie takes the buccal swab. Hopefully you guys can tell the very tip of the bill is bending. And that is a very cool and useful adaptation called rhynchokinesis that shorebirds, some shorebirds have. And so if you think about it, that would be a very handy tool to have in the curlew's toolbox for eating, right? So I'm going to show you another quick video of a curlew using its bill to forage, and think about how handy it would be to have the tip of your beak be able to bend and be able to help you pull up your prey out of the substrate. And then there's also some sensory organs in the tip of the bill that help them actually sense the prey underground. So take a look. Really helps it hone in on its resources. So after we take all of our measurements, it's time to put the transmitter on. And so we don't rush this process, obviously. And the harness kind of fits on the curlew. I liken it to like a climbing harness. So there's two little leather leg loops, and then it fits on the back like a fanny pack. And so in the beginning, when we started putting transmitters on birds, we were hoping we could figure out a way that the bird would communicate with us if it was uncomfortable, as we're putting that transmitter on, before we release it. Because we don't want to just slap on a piece of technology, onto an animal and release it and wish it good luck, right? So we actually did figure out a way that they let us know if maybe it's a little pinchy or it doesn't feel quite right. So what we did was we set up a small camping tent, nothing fancy, just a small camping tent, and we released the bird inside the tent. And so it's going to do one of two behaviors if it's uncomfortable. So take a minute to think about, like, let's pretend your pants all of a sudden are 3 sizes too small. Are you going to run around like crazy, or would you sit down waiting for somebody to bring you a pair of pants that fits? Well, curlews are actually going to sit down and wait. So they're going to wait to have that transmitter refitted until we get it just right. So we'll carefully take the bird out of the tent, we'll readjust that transmitter, and then this is what we want to see. So that female isn't worried about the bands on her legs. She doesn't care about that transmitter on her back. All she can think about right now is getting back to those eggs to incubate. Because remember, she's on duty. It's during the day, and her mate has no idea that she's just been snapped up off of her nest and getting banded right now. So soon as we know they're comfortable, we want to release them right away. And then we'll gather up all of our gear, we'll jump in our cars, and we're going to head to a brand new location, like a different vantage point. So that way we can watch to make sure that they go back to their nest. Because the longer we hang out there, they will not go back, because they view us as a predator, right? So the longer we hang out there, they're going to think that they're leading us back to that nest again. So we want to get out of there as soon as possible. And every single bird that we've ever trapped and banded has gone back to their nests. So that's super exciting. So our satellite tracking map, unfortunately, we're in a transition phase. So the map that you see here on your screen is not going to be the same map that we're using now. But if you guys are interested, I can be sure to send the directions on how to use our new map to Adra, and she will be able to send that out to you. But it basically works the same way. So with this map, all these dots show up, and you would click on a dot and it would show you the bird's name, or at least its leg flag alpha code if it didn't have a name yet. And then it tells you the last time that the satellite and the transmitter on the bird communicated with one another. So it tells you the day, date, and time. So the difference with the new map is you won't see the dots all laid out like this, but there'll be a legend with all the birds on the side, and then you click on each individual bird, and then you will see its migration route. And it's kind of the same way. It'll be like a Google type map where you can zoom in, and by zooming in, you can start to really see where the birds are going. So you'll see their tracks, just like a GPS. And I prefer looking at these maps in satellite mode, because then you can kind of gather that information and see what habitats are they utilizing throughout the day or throughout their overwintering grounds. So you can glean a lot of information from these maps. And I wish I had enough time to talk about all the amazing things we've learned about curlews by putting transmitters on them. But the two main things in the beginning we were hoping to get data on was, number one, their migratory connectivity. So basically, where are they going from point A to point B? So if we are putting transmitters on their breeding grounds, where are they heading to overwinter? And the other thing we were hoping is that we could maybe uncover what's happening with their population decline. And going back to the migratory connectivity, it's interesting to think that we were putting transmitters on birds for 10 years to this point. So we started in 2013, so almost 10 years. And we had a glaring black hole in our map. And so what I mean by that is that we know there's thousands of shorebirds and curlews on the coastal area of California, but none of our breeding territory birds ever really flew past the Central Valley of California for our, California birds. And so we just couldn't figure out, like, where are those coastal birds breeding? And so we have study sites from New Mexico that run all the way through the Intermountain West. So New Mexico, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and we also helped some scientists in British Columbia. And so it was just kind of mind-blowing that none of these birds were heading to the coast. And so when COVID hit, I ended up staying up here in New Meadows, when typically I would move to Boise for 3-4 months out of the season to study curlews down on the public lands. So with some grant funding from the Payette Children's Forest up here in McCall, I was able to study curlews up here on the private ranch lands. And so one of our first birds that we found, his name was Dozer, and he was banded in 2020, and he was from Indian Valley. And what was amazing about this guy is he was our very first breeding territory curlew that left for the coast of California. And he ended up in Morro Bay. And I know this kind of discovery doesn't sound super exciting, but if you think about the conservation implications of now having a transmitted bird in an area that's populated with people, instead of a transmitter bird hanging out in these huge agricultural fields where there's no people, that makes a really big difference. So we have people spotting our curlews now that have these transmitters, and they're emailing us saying, hey, we spotted a bird with a tracker. We called our local fish and game office. They let us know about your program. What more can you tell us about it? And so now we have this new engagement opportunity where people might not be having the same declines that or impacts that we're having here in Idaho, but perhaps they can help spread the awareness of what's happening and maybe help conserve their habitats on their overwintering grounds. And so the following year, we trapped Dozer's mate, Mimi, and she was our international traveler. So she actually overwintered in this beautiful biosphere in the upper Gulf of California and Colorado River Delta. And so these two actually spend their winters about 450 miles apart. And that's another one of the interesting things we learned about mated pairs is they don't overwinter in the same areas. And so I think I have the map here. Oh, I forgot to put this picture in. When we were transmitting and banding Mimi, we actually had to stop the process and before we released her because the ranchers were moving a huge herd of cattle down the road. And so it's just funny to think you just never know what's going to happen on a banding day. So that was kind of fun. So this is just to kind of give you guys like a relation of where these guys are spending their winter. So the blue star is up in Morro Bay where Dozer spends his winter. And then the heart represents where Mimi spends her winter. So it's roughly about 450 to 500 miles apart. But then come springtime, Dozer's going to come back to Indian Valley first, usually a couple weeks before Mimi. And then he's going to establish his old territory because the males have very high site fidelity. And then she's going to meet him a few weeks later. And then I was able to capture one picture of them together as he was initiating a nest. As you can see, he's kind of bowing down into a nest cup. You can't see the nest, but and then he calls her over to check it out. But as you could tell, hopefully, she has her eyes to the skies because there's a lot of ravens in that area. And so that was just a fun little capture. And then our latest bird from the West Central Mountains is Fuego. And he was banded in 2021. And he is in New Meadows. So he's only about 10 minutes from where I live. And what was really great about him is he took us to a new overwintering location. And it's just outside the San Francisco area called Bear Island in Redwood City, California. And it's basically this beautiful 3,000 acre protected island that's just this complex of beautiful, wet, marshy, kind of wetland areas. And Fuego got his name because the day that I found his nest, I actually came back by later in the afternoon and noticed that the field was on fire. And so ranchers will sometimes burn off sections of their land that either has old silage or old dry material as to, kind of burn it off early. So in case there was some type of fire event. But what was very scary is when I set my scope up, I couldn't see the nest and I should have been able to see the nest. So I was really worried that this nest failed. And so I went to a different vantage point later in the evening to see if a switch would happen. And the smoke had finally settled and the switch did happen. So the male came in and the female jumped off. And it was really interesting because she flew really close to where I was in one of the little farm canals. And she must have taken a bath for what had to have lasted about a half an hour. So I think she was just shrouded in smoke all day long. So I was really excited to think that, she toughed it out and sat tight to that nest and didn't leave those eggs. So we started studying the curlews in 2009. So we didn't have funding to transmitter birds until 2013. So there was this short period that if we found a dead curlew, it typically looked something like this. It looks like a predator event, right? Maybe like a coyote got this bird. You can see this, the head here, there's a wing, there's a leg down here. So when we start to think about our hypotheses and thinking about predators, bird after bird like this, we started thinking, okay, maybe predators are the main impact for this decline. But as you guys probably can figure, when you have a hypothesis, you kind of get an answer rolling, it tends to lead to more questions. So if predators were the main issue, you start thinking to yourself, okay, what is the main predator? How do we control it? And are we allowed to control it? So lots more questions tend to come up. But during this time, we developed a really great relationship with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game's Wildlife Health Laboratory. So this lab is located right next door to Eagle Island State Park. And it's really cool. It's basically their job to figure out what killed an animal. And so they offered to us that if we wanted to bring in our carcasses or any pieces that we found of curlews, they would x-ray them for us. So this is the very first x-ray that we ever got back. And so the long bluish purple lines are the bones, but I want to draw your attention inside this red circle. As you can see, it's really, really bright white. So any guesses what shows up really, really bright white on an x-ray? If anybody's out there thinking metal, you're absolutely correct. So this bird actually had not been taken down by a predator first. It was actually shot first. And so this is a small excerpt of the official forensics report that we get back with each bird. And so as you can see, the preliminary and the final diagnosis are the same: gunshot and then the scavenging event. So these birds are getting shot and left on the landscape, and then say a badger or a coyote comes by and just picks the rest of it apart. So we knew recreational shooting was going to have some form of an impact on the population. We really just had no idea until we started taking the birds into the lab how big of an impact it was actually having. And so from 2013, when we started placing transmitters on birds, to 2018, we lost roughly half of our transmitted birds to poaching in southwest Idaho. And as you can imagine, already being in a decline of 95%, they can't sustain at this rate of loss. And so the big push has been on for our education and outreach efforts to get this word out to the public that it's a migratory species, it's illegal to shoot, and all the things that come up along with that, whether it's a felony, whether it ends up loss of hunting privileges, and all those things that come with something like that. So our education and outreach has really taken off with this knowledge at the time that was new of what an impact illegal shooting was having. And so there's one other spot I just want to talk about really quick, and it's south of the Boise Airport. It's the Morley Nelson Snake River Birds of Prey National Conservation Area. And we first started studying out there in 2017, and it was a really rough start for the curlews. In fact, we found 3 of our transmitted birds shot, I think basically within about a month and a half of each other. And then we also found a bird that was unmarked, meaning it wasn't banded, it wasn't transmitted, so it wasn't a part of our research study. We just found it incidentally on the roadside, on the public lands. And so when a bird goes down, basically what we would watch for is on the map, the dot would stop moving. And so that could mean a multitude of things. It could mean that maybe the transmitter's malfunctioning, perhaps the transmitter fell off, which has happened a few times, or the bird's in trouble. So what we do is we have specialized equipment. It's like an antenna that we can take out, and the antenna can hear the signal. It like hears the ping inside the transmitter. So to know where to start, will utilize the last set of GPS coordinates that we have from the transmitter and the communication it had with the satellite. But what's different about these transmitters as opposed to a handheld GPS is with a handheld, you can typically get within 4 or 5 meters of what you're looking for, right? But with these transmitters, you can go right to that GPS point, but that bird could be down anywhere, maybe 200 to 300 meters around that location. So it's not as easy to find it, especially without that antenna. So the biologist that we sent out there, he plugged in the coordinates into the Google map, and that's where these X's landed. But what was even more striking is there was a public pin that was dropped on the map, on Google Maps, that said shooting spot. And I didn't know that you could share a pin like publicly to the general population. I knew you could share pins among people. So this was kind of interesting to me. But obviously you can see that these birds are radiating around this area. And so obviously we're not stating that the person who dropped that public pin is the one who shot these birds. But what this does suggest is this is a highly used recreational shooting area. And so the silver lining to this kind of tragedy is that we now have real-time data that all we have to do is jump on the cell phone. We call the Fish and Game and the BLM, and we now are creating these maps of hotspots of where birds are being shot. And so now theoretically enforcement has these areas and they can patrol these areas more and ensuring people are shooting responsibly. And just another note about how difficult it is for these birds to try to sustain their population is these two birds right here, JK and KJ, they were a mated pair and they were shot, I think they were shot 2 weeks apart after their nest had already hatched. And so curlews are not a species where another set of parents is going to come in and care for those chicks. So theoretically, we didn't just lose 2 out of the breeding population, we have lost 6. So again, that rate of loss is going to be really hard for them to come back from. So again, our outreach efforts launched pretty much immediately. And again, I wish I had more time tonight to go through all the different efforts we've done, but I just want to hit on 3 of the main ones. And one of which is our Know Your Target, Protect a Species messaging that we've been taking into hunters education classes. And I want to point out, we're offering these programs to these classes, not because we think hunters are shooting curlews, because that's why hunters are in these classes. They're there to learn what they can and cannot shoot. But our thinking was, you know, hunters run the landscape all the time. And so it's kind of a, hopefully to enlist more boots on the ground, so to speak. And so it's been wildly successful. We have a lot of the educators asking for more programs. And what's really great is that if the BLM has a coordinator that's able to bring in a live bird, they get to come in for 15 minutes with me. And having that live bird in front of the class just captures everybody's attention, like immediately. And I mean, to see a huge great horned owl or a huge Swainson's hawk right up close and personal really gets the attention and gets them thinking about, you know, how can people illegally shoot, you know, something as beautiful as this? And it really helps deepen that connection. And so this program is basically just designed to talk briefly about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and how it protects birds from people. And it also just gets them thinking about what it means to be an ethical and knowledgeable hunter when they're on the landscape, and how their good decisions while they're out there can help, you know, save a species and help continue that species for people to enjoy into the future. And so this was a great collaboration between the Idaho Bird Conservation Partnership, the Idaho Fish and Game, and also the Bureau of Land Management with us at the IBO. And then probably our longest running outreach effort has been the Curlews in the Classroom program. This has been such a fun thing to be a part of. I've been running the program now for about 7 years. and it's K through 12. It can be tailored for any grade level. And we also help educators with some STEM curriculum. And so that kind of helps the students connect a little better. And then being able to teach the kids how to access the map and learn about science and technology, and how it helps us learn about the birds and their migration. So that program has been really successful. And I created a spin-off of this called Curlew's Outside the Classroom, which is what you guys are going to be a part of. And so the idea behind this was, I had been going into classrooms for all these years, and these educators would listen to me give this program sometimes 8 times in a row during the day for each period. And I thought, they can be giving this program at this point. And I thought, how else can I help them deepen that engagement with their students? So I thought, well, why don't I have a fun field day just for educators and get them out in the field? And I started it down in Boise, and it can be kind of shocking out in the public lands if you haven't been out there. There's areas that are not so pretty. It's kind of like a dump, basically. There's many times I've gotten to the public lands first thing in the morning before sunrise, and there's piles of burning trash. And so it can be very eye-opening. And so getting the educators out there to see all the different things that not only the curlews, but other wildlife are up against when they're out there, with all the different types of human impacts, and losing territory due to, ATV trails that keep getting cut in when people don't stay on the trail, and just all that additional pressure from, the Boise population that's exploding. And so it has worked out really, really well. And teachers are now connecting with other teachers about curlews, and working on different projects together. So that has been a really great way to engage. And it's open to master naturalists and anybody else who might be educating people, as well as state agency folks. And so I like to put this slide up there because I want people to know that we can't do something like this alone. As a small nonprofit, partnerships and collaborations are huge. We're very grateful to have collaborated with the Golden Eagle Audubon Society, and other places all throughout the states, and private landowners who let us also access their land. So a big thanks to everyone. And if you have any questions and you might not be joining us for the field trip, feel free to email me. I love answering questions. And if you are on social media, we would love to have you on the Curlew crew. So hit a like and a share. That's a great way to help curlew conservation. And you can also join us on Intermountain Bird Observatory to nerd out on all the other cool birds that we work with. And of course, we're on Twitter and Instagram as well. So hopefully I will see the majority of you coming up on Thursday and Saturday. And just a quick note, I've been checking the weather just about every hour, and it looks like Thursday and Saturday have a slight chance of snow. It did snow on one of my other classes last week, but it moved out fairly quickly. So just be sure that you guys dress in layers. Don't forget your binoculars. I've had quite a few people forget their binoculars in their excitement of coming out. If you have a scope, feel free to bring it, and bring some hot tea or some coffee to keep you warm. And we're going to have a great time. Hopefully see some good bird activity out there. So thank you for joining me tonight, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, Heather. That was amazing.
Yeah.
It's great to hear about all the outreach you guys are doing in education. Super important. But yeah, we did have some questions come through during the presentation, and then everybody else, if there were any questions that you have for Heather, now's the time to ask them. So throw those in the chat or the Q&A box. But someone had a good question from the beginning of what exactly defines a shorebird?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know how to answer.
Bird that lives on the shore.
Yeah, for sure. Oh my gosh, I'm kind of embarrassed. I don't know how to define a shorebird. But I think basically that's it. They're on the shore. It's a whole family of birds. Like I said, the killdeer are like the little cousin. The snipes are in there, and all your other wading birds. And the one thing that I didn't mention in the program is I have been collaborating with some folks in the United Kingdom because their shorebirds are in trouble because their main issue isn't so much shooting as it is they're losing their coastlines. The development has just gone through the roof, I guess. So their Eurasian curlew is in a 95% decline. And so that's kind of been an interesting connection to make, to get to educate people that this just isn't in our backyard with these guys. You know, it's a global issue. And it's interesting. You know, a lot of people don't understand why they come to the Intermountain West, right? Why would they be on the shore and then come to this like desert habitat? But that short grassland habitat allows them to nest and be able to have that view, the 360 view all the way around when predators are around. And then when that grass starts to grow for the month and those chicks hatch out, then they have concealment. So that's just such an unusual thing to see this huge shorebird on the public lands in Boise. And I get that all the time. But you have definitely tasked me with a better way to define what a shorebird is. So thank you. I'll have that answer for the field trip.
Yeah, I would think that they have kind of, a lot of shorebirds have like unique legs. Obviously they need like certain adaptations to be able to navigate the shoreline. So I feel like most shorebirds I know have like longer legs, but anyway, like you said, we'll know next time. Great question. Someone had a question when you were showing the video footage of the curlew eating. Do the females eat the same things in the same way in the night?
As far as I know, yes. And I was talking to Stephanie Coates, the master student, and she always thought it would be interesting to do a study on the length of the bird's bills because geographically, I mean, they're not just different between male and female, but geographically they're different. Like when I got to go to Wyoming to study the birds, the females' bills were so long. I felt like they cast a shadow when they flew over your head. And so there's geographic differences as well in the sizes. So it'd be interesting to piece together all that different migratory connectivity and bill lengths to see, are they foraging in different places? Like, are longer bills for mud flats? Are the shorter bills more for the sand? So that's the cool thing I think about shorebirds is there's still a lot of unknowns. You think after all this time we'd have it all down pat, but there's still so much to learn. And the bill is it's just the coolest adaptation. I mean, in general for birds, obviously, but that rhynchokinesis to me is just phenomenal.
Yeah, that was something new I learned tonight. And yeah, I agree. It's pretty amazing. Someone else had a question. If the mate doesn't come back for the handoff, what does the remaining parent do?
Good question. So typically curlews are considered monogamous. But another thing we learned through the transmittering process is that if one of the mates gets shot or eaten by a predator, the other mate will try to find another one if there's enough time in the season. So what'll happen is if a mated pair loses a nest, they'll try to secure another nest. And we've had one curlew try 3 times. So back to what we learned with the mated pairs is we had our first celebrity breakup. So there was a pair, their names were Thor and Valkyrie, and they were in the Middleton area. And the Middleton Middle School won the naming contest that we have with all the schools. So their mascot is the Viking. And so they picked Viking names. So they won. And so Thor and Valkyrie had a successful nest their first season. They came back the second season and the nest failed. In the third season, we checked the map in the spring and they came back. Their dots were sort of close on the map, but each day her dot kept getting further and further away from his dot. And so we kind of didn't know what was going on. And then all of a sudden she just took off the public lands, off territory in some public field or some private field. And at that point, we were already kind of done studying on that section of the land because we had enough data to show that the shooting was having the biggest impact. But I went out at the end of the season because I was just kind of tied to that area. And I went to his territory and he came out of the weeds. I saw his transmitter. And I was kind of shaking my finger at him saying, what did you do to Val? Why did she leave? And then within like a minute, a new female came out behind him. So I don't know if they had a nest or not, but he did pair up again. So it was just an interesting finding that, you know, here you had two healthy birds still alive, and one just decided either maybe she didn't feel safe on that territory because she lost the nest before, or if she was just like, I'm bored. I'm done with this area. I don't like the shooting. I'm leaving. So that was kind of an interesting finding.
All right. And then someone else had a question kind of relating to the issue of shooting. Is there any information on the effects of specifically lead bullets on scavengers, badgers, raptors, you know, things that might eat shot curlews or other birds?
We don't have any studies going on that, but I do know there are stuff out there. There was a volunteer, I think, that was working with us for a while that I think was doing a project through Boise State on that. So I think if you Google that up, you can probably find some papers out there. And the latest paper that we collaborated on, it was like an 18, I think there was like 18 collaborators on this paper, but we do have, it's the first paper that documents illegal shooting and the impacts it's having on the public land. So that was super exciting. I think that was a year and a half ago now. But the lead issue is not something that we have studied, but it's obviously an issue. Like, I know people are asked that they clean up the carcasses, the ground squirrels, if they're using lead, because obviously everything's out there eating them, you know? And so it's just whether people do or not.
Yeah, I think it takes kind of continued outreach and education
And that's a hard one. I mean, the big thing that I remember hearing most about is shooters were like, oh, well, it's just too expensive to change. You know, lead is so cheap. And but I don't think that argument can hold water much anymore, because I think it's become much more reasonable. I don't know what the prices are, but I feel like I've read recently that that it's coming down in price. So it's a hot button topic, I will tell you that.
Yeah, I believe it. Well, I think that was the last question that came in. So if no one has any further questions, I think we can wrap it up. But I just wanted to say thanks again, Heather, so much for doing the presentation and sharing your research and stories from the field. And also thanks so much for leading the 2 field trips this week. I hope you all have a great time and doesn't snow on you too much on Thursday.
Yeah, bring your Curlew mojo and your sunshine mojo.
Yeah, and thanks everybody so much for coming tonight. I hope
Yes,
you enjoyed it, and we hope to see you again next time. Take care.